Samuel Mitchell wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he surveyed his vast homestead in the Arizona Territory. The year was 1885, and the land stretched endlessly before him, dotted with cattle and bordered by red canyon walls that seemed to touch the sky. He had built this ranch from nothing, starting with just a broken-down wagon and a handful of cattle 15 years ago. Now, at 52 years old, he owned more land than he knew what to do with. The drought had been merciless that summer. Wells that had never run dry were now nothing but dust and stones. Samuel watched helplessly as his cattle grew thinner by the day, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. The nearest town was 3 days' ride away, and even there, water was being rationed. He had enough reserves in his main well to last maybe another month. But after that, he would face the same fate as many other ranchers in the territory: abandonment of the land his hands had worked so hard to tame. On this particular evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of orange and purple, Samuel noticed smoke rising from beyond the eastern ridge of his property. It was not the thick, dark smoke of a wildfire, but the thin, steady wisp of a cooking fire. Someone was camping on his land, and in these parts, that usually meant trouble. Rustlers, outlaws, or worse, Apache raiders who had been causing problems for settlers throughout the territory. Samuel loaded his rifle and saddled his horse, a sturdy mare named Belle who had been with him since his early days on the ranch. As he rode toward the smoke, his mind raced with possibilities. The Apache had been largely peaceful in recent years, confined to reservations by the government. But there were still small bands that roamed free, and tensions between settlers and natives remained high. Just last month, a ranch 50 miles south had been attacked, though no one was hurt. As he crested the ridge, Samuel expected to see a gang of rough men, or perhaps a family of desperate travelers. Instead, what he found made him stop his horse and stare in amazement. Below him, in a small valley that bordered his property, was a makeshift camp unlike anything he had ever seen. There were perhaps 20 people, mostly women, children, and elderly men, huddled around a small fire. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. But these were not settlers or outlaws. These were Apache people, and they were clearly in desperate condition. The children sat close to their mothers, their large eyes reflecting the firelight as they watched the adults portion out what appeared to be their last bits of food. Samuel could see that they had no horses, no wagons, and very few belongings. Whatever had brought them here, they were refugees rather than raiders. Samuel slowly dismounted his horse and approached the camp with his rifle lowered but ready. An elderly Apache man rose to meet him, his dignity intact despite his obvious poverty. The man spoke no English, but his gestures were clear. They meant no harm and were simply seeking shelter. Through a combination of hand signals and the few Apache words Samuel had picked up over the years, he learned that they were part of a band that had left their reservation in search of better conditions. The reservation, they explained through gestures, had been a place of starvation and disease. The government rations were insufficient, and many children had died during the harsh winter. This small group, led by the elderly man whose name Samuel understood to be Nalnish, had left in desperation, hoping to find somewhere they could live off the land as their ancestors had done. Samuel found himself in an impossible situation. Legally, he should report these Apache to the authorities, who would force them back to the reservation. The territorial government had made it clear that all Apache belonged on designated lands, and harboring them could result in serious legal consequences for him. Moreover, many of his neighbors would see any kindness to Apache as a betrayal of white solidarity in a harsh land where cooperation between settlers was often a matter of survival. Yet as he looked at the hungry children and exhausted mothers, Samuel could not bring himself to turn them away. His own childhood had been marked by poverty and displacement when his family lost their farm in Missouri. He remembered the kindness of strangers who had helped his family when they had nothing. And he could not forget the Christian teachings of his mother, who had always said that charity was the highest virtue. The practical problems seemed insurmountable. Samuel had enough food stored for the winter, but not enough to feed 20 additional people. His well, though deeper than most, was already stressed by the drought. More importantly, if word got out that he was sheltering Apache on his land, he could face violence from his neighbors, government prosecution, or both. The territorial authorities had little patience with settlers who they saw as sympathizing with the native population. But as Samuel looked at Nalnish's weathered face, he saw something that reminded him of his own grandfather. A man who had fought in wars, survived hardships, and maintained his dignity through it all. These were not the savage raiders that newspapers wrote about, but families trying to survive in a world that had changed around them. The children reminded him of his own son, who had died of fever 3 years earlier, leaving Samuel and his wife Martha alone on their vast homestead. After an hour of difficult communication, Samuel made a decision that would change his life forever. He gestured for Nalnish to follow him and led the elderly Apache leader to the edge of his property, pointing out the boundaries of his land. Through gestures and simple words, he indicated that the Apache families could stay on his property, at least temporarily, until they could figure out a more permanent solution. Nalnish's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, and he clasped Samuel's hands in his own weathered ones. The old Apache man spoke rapidly in his native tongue, words that Samuel could not understand but whose meaning was clear. This was a blessing beyond what they had hoped for. Samuel felt a mixture of pride and terror at his decision. He was about to become responsible for 20 lives at a time when he was not certain he could even maintain his own ranch. That night, Samuel rode back to his ranch house with his mind spinning. He would need to talk to Martha, his wife, about what he had done. Martha had always been a practical woman, more concerned with survival than sentiment, and she might not approve of taking on such a burden. Moreover, they would need to plan carefully how to provide for so many additional people without drawing attention from neighbors or government officials. As he approached his house, Samuel could see the lamplight in the kitchen window, where Martha would be waiting for him. She always waited up when he rode out after dark, worried about outlaws or wild animals. He had no idea how he was going to explain what he had just committed them to, but he knew that his decision was final. For better or worse, he had offered sanctuary to people who needed it, and Samuel Mitchell was a man who kept his word. The next morning would bring new challenges as Samuel began to understand the full implications of his choice. He had no idea that his simple act of compassion was about to set in motion events that would bring hundreds of Apache to his doorstep and forever change the relationship between settlers and natives in the Arizona Territory. Martha Mitchell stood at the kitchen window, watching her husband's silhouette approach through the moonlight. When Samuel finally entered their modest ranch house, she could tell immediately that something significant had happened. His usually confident stride seemed hesitant, and he avoided her eyes as he hung his hat on the wooden peg by the door. Samuel told Martha everything, from finding the Apache families to his promise that they could stay on the property. Martha listened in silence, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of their fireplace. Martha had lived on the frontier her entire life. She had seen the violent conflicts between settlers and Apache, had heard the stories of raids and massacres on both sides. She had also seen the conditions on the reservations during their occasional trips to the trading post near Fort Apache. The government's treatment of the native people was something that had always troubled her Christian conscience, though she had never spoken about it openly. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, Martha looked at her husband and nodded slowly. She understood that Samuel had made the only decision he could live with, and she would support him. However, she was also practical enough to understand the enormous challenges they now faced. 20 additional people meant 20 additional mouths to feed, and their food stores, while substantial, were not unlimited. The next morning, Samuel and Martha loaded a wagon with supplies and rode out to the Apache camp. In the daylight, the condition of the refugees was even more apparent. Several of the children showed signs of malnutrition, and many of the adults had injuries or illnesses that had gone untreated. Martha immediately began organizing care for the sick, drawing on her years of experience as the only medical help available for miles around. Nalnish introduced his extended family to the Mitchells. There were his two daughters, Ayana and Itzel, each with children of their own. His son, Kuruk, had been injured in a fall and could barely walk. There were cousins, nephews, and family friends who had joined their exodus from the reservation. Each had their own story of hardship and desperation that had led them to leave the only legal home they had. Samuel quickly realized that the Apache families possessed skills that could be invaluable on his ranch. Several of the men were experienced with horses and cattle, knowledge they had gained during their years of confinement when they were forced to learn farming and ranching. The women knew how to find water in the desert, how to preserve meat without salt, and how to make clothing and tools from materials the land provided. More importantly, Samuel discovered that the Apache had an intimate knowledge of the land that he had never possessed, despite his 15 years in the territory. They knew which plants could be eaten during times of scarcity, where to find water sources that did not appear on any maps, and how to predict weather patterns by reading signs that were invisible to Samuel's eyes. This knowledge became crucial as the drought continued to worsen. Within a week, the Apache families had established a more permanent camp in the valley that bordered Samuel's property. They built shelters using traditional methods, but incorporating materials that Samuel provided. The children, who had been listless and quiet when they first arrived, began to show signs of recovery as regular meals restored their strength. Samuel found himself looking forward to his daily visits to the camp, fascinated by the different way of life he was witnessing. However, the secret could not be kept indefinitely. Samuel's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Bill Crawford, noticed the increased activity around Samuel's property. Crawford had always been suspicious of Samuel's friendly attitude toward the few Apache he encountered during their cattle dealings. When Crawford spotted smoke from multiple fires coming from Samuel's land, he decided to investigate. Crawford arrived at Samuel's ranch house on a hot afternoon, claiming he needed to borrow some tools but clearly looking for information. Samuel tried to deflect his questions, but Crawford was persistent. Finally, Samuel made a decision that would prove crucial. He decided to trust Crawford with the truth, hoping that his neighbor might understand the humanitarian nature of his decision. Crawford's reaction was exactly what Samuel had feared. The man exploded in anger, accusing Samuel of endangering every white family in the territory. He threatened to report the Apache presence to the territorial authorities and warned Samuel that other neighbors would consider his actions a betrayal. Crawford stormed off, promising that Samuel would regret his foolish compassion. That evening, Samuel called a meeting with Nalnish and the other Apache leaders. Through their improved communication, which now included some English words that the Apache had learned, and more Apache phrases that Samuel and Martha had picked up, he explained the danger they all now faced. The Apache leaders understood immediately. They had lived with the threat of government force for years and knew how quickly their situation could become desperate. Nalnish made a suggestion that surprised Samuel. Rather than hiding or running, the Apache leader proposed that they should be completely open about their presence. If they were working productively on Samuel's ranch, if they were clearly not raiding or causing trouble, perhaps the authorities might be more inclined to find a peaceful solution. It was a risky strategy, but Nalnish argued that hiding would only make them look guilty of wrongdoing. Samuel spent a sleepless night considering this proposal. The next morning, he made another decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He would not only allow the Apache to remain visible on his property, but he would actively integrate them into his ranch operations. If anyone asked, he would say he had hired them as workers, which was not entirely untrue, since they were indeed contributing significantly to the ranch's operations. The arrangement worked better than Samuel had dared hope. The Apache knowledge of desert survival proved invaluable as the drought continued. They showed Samuel how to dig wells in places he would never have considered, using techniques that had been developed over centuries of life in the harsh landscape. They helped him move his cattle to areas where hidden springs provided water, and they showed him which desert plants could supplement the cattle's diet when grass became scarce. More importantly, the Apache families brought a sense of community to Samuel's ranch that he and Martha had not experienced since their son's death. The children played games that reminded Martha of her own childhood, and the adults shared stories around evening fires that helped pass the long, hot nights. Samuel found himself learning not just practical skills but also a different way of looking at the land and his place in it. Word of the unusual arrangement began to spread throughout the territory, but the reaction was mixed. Some neighbors, like Crawford, remained hostile and suspicious. However, others were curious about Samuel's success in maintaining his cattle despite the severe drought. When they learned that Apache knowledge was responsible for finding new water sources, some ranchers began to reconsider their prejudices. The territorial authorities, when they finally learned of the situation, were initially inclined to force the Apache back to their reservation. However, Samuel had prepared for this eventuality. He had documented the Apache family's contributions to his ranch, their peaceful behavior, and their desperate circumstances on the reservation. When the Indian agent arrived to investigate, Samuel presented a compelling case for allowing the Apache to remain. The agent was a practical man named Thomas Henley, who had seen the conditions on the reservations and was not entirely unsympathetic to the Apache plight. He was also impressed by the evident prosperity of Samuel's ranch, despite the drought conditions that had ruined many of his neighbors. After several days of investigation, Henley proposed a compromise that would change the legal status of the Apache families and set a precedent for future relations between settlers and natives. As summer turned to autumn, Samuel began to realize that his simple act of compassion had grown into something much larger than he had ever imagined. The Apache families were no longer refugees camping on his land, but had become an integral part of his ranch operation. However, the biggest surprise was yet to come, and it would arrive with the first light of dawn on a day that would forever change the landscape of the Arizona Territory. Samuel Mitchell woke before dawn on October 15, 1885, to a sound he had never heard before in his 15 years on the ranch. It was not the usual morning sounds of cattle lowing or birds singing, but something that made his heart race with both wonder and terror. From beyond the eastern ridge came the sound of hundreds of voices, speaking in the Apache tongue, accompanied by the soft thunder of many feet walking across the desert floor. Samuel quickly dressed and stepped outside his ranch house, where he found Martha already standing in the yard, her face pale in the pre-dawn light. Together, they watched as the sun began to rise over the ridge, revealing a sight that would be burned into their memories forever. Stretching across the desert, as far as they could see, was a procession of Apache people. Men, women, children, and elders, walking slowly but steadily toward Samuel's ranch. Nalnish emerged from the valley where his family had been staying and approached Samuel with an expression of both pride and apprehension. Through the mixture of English and Apache that had become their common language, Nalnish explained what Samuel was witnessing. Word had spread throughout Apache communities across the territory and beyond about the white rancher who had offered sanctuary to Apache families. More importantly, news had traveled about the success of the arrangement, the respect shown to Apache ways, and the prosperity that had resulted from the partnership. The approaching crowd was not a random gathering but a carefully organized migration. These were Apache from multiple reservations, from hidden communities in the mountains, and from bands that had been living as refugees in Mexico. They represented different Apache groups, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Western Apache, who had rarely come together in such numbers since the end of the Apache Wars. They had come because they had heard of a place where Apache could live with dignity, where their knowledge was valued, and where their children could be safe. Samuel stood speechless as the magnitude of the situation became clear. He had offered shelter to 20 people, and now faced the arrival of what appeared to be several hundred Apache, possibly more than 1,000. His ranch, large as it was, could not possibly accommodate such numbers. Moreover, the legal implications were staggering. The territorial authorities would almost certainly view this as an uprising or invasion, regardless of the peaceful intentions of the Apache people. As the sun fully rose, Samuel could see the organization and discipline of the approaching group. This was not a chaotic flight, but a planned migration, led by respected Apache leaders. At the head of the procession walked an elderly woman whose bearing commanded immediate respect. Nalnish identified her as Lozan, the legendary Apache warrior and medicine woman who was sister to the famous chief Victorio. Her presence indicated that this migration had the blessing of the most respected Apache leaders. Behind Lozan came other figures that Nalnish named with reverence: surviving members of Cochise's band, relatives of Geronimo, who had chosen not to follow him into Mexico, and leaders from Apache groups that had maintained their independence in the mountains. They carried few possessions, but they brought with them the accumulated wisdom and traditions of their people. Samuel realized that he faced a decision that would echo through history. He could try to turn away this massive gathering, which would likely result in violence and tragedy. He could abandon his ranch and flee, leaving the Apache to face the inevitable military response alone. Or he could stand by his principles and try to find a way to accommodate this unprecedented situation. Martha, who had been silent throughout the morning, finally spoke. She reminded Samuel of their son, who had died 3 years earlier, and how empty their ranch had felt since then. She pointed out that the original Apache families had brought life and purpose back to their land. If they were going to face danger, she said, they should face it while doing what was right. Samuel made his decision. He would welcome the Apache people and do everything in his power to find a peaceful solution to the crisis that was about to unfold. He sent riders to notify the territorial authorities of the situation, hoping that advance warning might prevent a violent misunderstanding. He also sent messages to his neighbors, both those who supported him and those who opposed him, asking for their help in managing what could become a humanitarian disaster. The next few hours were chaotic as hundreds of Apache families found places to set up temporary camps across Samuel's vast property. The ranch hands, both white and Apache, worked frantically to distribute water and what food was available. Martha organized the other ranch women, including the Apache women who had been living there for months, to provide medical care for exhausted travelers and sick children. What amazed Samuel most was the discipline and organization of the Apache people themselves. Despite their numbers and the stress of their journey, there was no disorder or conflict. Leaders emerged naturally to coordinate the establishment of camps, the care of children and elders, and the distribution of resources. It was clear that this migration had been planned carefully and that the Apache people were committed to maintaining peace. By midday, riders began arriving with responses to Samuel's messages. Some neighbors came offering help, bringing supplies and additional water. Others arrived to witness what they saw as either a miracle or a catastrophe. The territorial authorities' response was more measured than Samuel had feared. Rather than sending troops immediately, they sent negotiators, recognizing that any violence could spark a wider conflict across the territory. The negotiations that followed over the next several days were unlike anything that had occurred in the history of white-Apache relations. Rather than dictating terms to a defeated people, government representatives found themselves dealing with Apache leaders who had come voluntarily and who presented reasonable demands for peaceful coexistence. The Apache did not want charity but opportunity. The chance to use their skills and knowledge in partnership with sympathetic ranchers and farmers. Samuel found himself at the center of discussions that would reshape the relationship between settlers and Apache throughout the Southwest. Government officials, initially skeptical, became convinced when they saw the evidence of successful cooperation on Samuel's ranch. The drought that had devastated other properties had barely affected Samuel's operation, thanks to Apache knowledge of water sources and desert survival techniques. The solution that eventually emerged was unprecedented in its scope and vision. Rather than forcing all the Apache back to reservations, the territorial government agreed to establish a series of cooperative communities where Apache families could live and work in partnership with white settlers. Samuel's ranch became the model for this new arrangement. But the concept would be expanded to include other willing ranchers and areas of public land. The legal framework took months to establish, but the practical arrangements began immediately. Apache families spread out across the territory, joining ranches and farms where their skills were needed and valued. Some returned to traditional lands that had been abandoned, where they established new communities that operated as bridges between Apache and white cultures. Samuel's ranch remained the heart of this new experiment in cooperation. The original 20 Apache refugees became leaders in establishing other settlements and in teaching both Apache and white communities how to live and work together. Children who had arrived as starving refugees grew up bilingual and bicultural, serving as translators and mediators in a region that had known only conflict for decades. The changes were not without problems. Some white settlers remained hostile to the arrangement, and some Apache rejected the idea of cooperation with their former enemies. Violence occasionally flared, and there were legal and political challenges that took years to resolve. However, the basic success of the cooperative communities could not be denied. Samuel Mitchell, who had begun as a struggling rancher trying to survive a drought, found himself remembered as the man who helped end the Apache Wars, not through violence but through compassion and practical cooperation. His simple offer of shelter to a desperate family had grown into a movement that transformed the American Southwest and provided a model for peaceful relations between different cultures. Years later, when historians asked Samuel about his motivations, he always gave the same simple answer. He had seen hungry children and remembered his Christian duty to help those in need. He had never imagined that such a small act of kindness would change the course of history, but he never regretted the choice he made on that evening when he first encountered Nulnish and his family in the valley beyond his ranch. The Apache Nation had indeed arrived by sunrise, not as conquerors or raiders, but as partners in building a new kind of community in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the Arizona Territory. Samuel's offer of his homestead had become an offer of hope, and that hope had transformed an entire region.